Born into a world of privilege and expectation, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill's early life was one marked by contrasts. The son of Lord Randolph Churchill, a prominent conservative politician, and Jenny Jerome, an American socialite, Winston's childhood was framed by the weight of aristocracy and political legacy. Yet, despite the grandeur surrounding him, the young Churchill was a figure defined by loneliness and a hunger for recognition. His father, distant and often critical, provided little warmth, leaving Winston with a fierce desire to prove himself, not just as his father's son, but as a man of his own making. Churchill's early education was turbulent, shaped by an almost constant sense of inadequacy. At Harrow, the prestigious British boarding school, he struggled with both academics and discipline. But what he lacked in conventional scholastic ability, he more than made up for with a fierce determination. It was here, amidst the relentless pressure to succeed, that Churchill began to understand the power of words. He may have been an underperformer in mathematics and Latin, but his oratory skills were undeniably strong, an early indicator of the talent that would define his political career. Despite the hurdles of his school years, the young Churchill had an unshakable belief in his own destiny. The world, he believed, had a place for him, a place at the center of affairs. This vision became the driving force behind his life. What was perhaps most striking about these early years was his internal fire, an enduring desire not only to succeed, but to transform the very fabric of British politics. Churchill's time at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst brought further confrontation with authority. Known for his rebellious spirit and his refusal to conform to the traditional expectations of a young officer, he stood out among his peers. Yet this period also marked his first major engagement with the wider world. As an officer in the British Army, Churchill was dispatched to India and then to the Sudan, where he encountered the harsh realities of imperial warfare. These formative years shaped him in profound ways, deepening his sense of responsibility to the empire and its far-flung dominions. Through his military experiences, Churchill became both a witness to history and an active participant in its unfolding drama. His time in the field hardened him and nurtured his budding political ideals. The British Empire, with all its pomp and pride, was both a source of fascination and an object of critique. Churchill, in his early 20s, began to forge a vision of leadership that would see Britain wield its power in a world shifting dramatically towards industrialization, modern warfare, and shifting alliances. However, as much as he longed for adventure, there was always the quieter, more cerebral side of Churchill, a man deeply engaged with the grand theories of governance and statecraft. His early political writings, while hardly known to the public at the time, hinted at the depth of his thinking. In the solitude of his study, the seeds of his ideological development were sown. It was here that Churchill's belief in Britain's exceptionalism, as well as his early economic theories, took root. His writings, much like his speeches later in life, blended historical insight with a passionate call to action. Despite his love for the military and the thrill of battle, Churchill's path was always clear. He was destined for political life. He began to think not just of battles fought with weapons, but of those fought with words and ideas. And so, in the early years of the 20th century, Winston Churchill embarked on a political journey that would see him shift allegiances, battle through the fog of war, and ultimately redefine the destiny of a nation. At the age of 26, Churchill stepped into the political world as the Member of Parliament for Oldham, a seat he won as a member of the Conservative Party. This was the beginning of a long, tumultuous, and often controversial career in politics. Churchill's entrance into Parliament was not one of smooth sailing. He was known for his impetuous nature, and the sheer force of his personality made him both a magnetic figure and one that people could easily love or loathe. Despite the traditional expectations of his lineage, Churchill quickly found himself at odds with the conservative establishment. His early speeches revealed his strong-willed, almost combative style, and his ideas were radical for the time. He argued passionately for social reform, speaking about the need for improving the welfare of the working class and calling for reforms in education, health, and housing. Churchill's speeches were filled with the idealism of a young man who believed that government should serve not just the elite, but the people, and he had no hesitation in challenging the party lines of his own conservative colleagues. Within the ranks of the Conservative Party, Churchill's outspoken views began to attract both admiration and resentment. He was not an obedient follower of party doctrine, a fact that would become a recurring theme throughout his career. Instead, Churchill sought to forge his own path, guided by his belief in the necessity of progressive policies that could serve Britain's future, even if it meant going against the established powers of his party. It was in these early years that Churchill began his complex relationship with the Liberal Party. In 1904, after several years of growing dissatisfaction with the Conservative Party's reluctance to adopt progressive reforms, Churchill made one of the most significant decisions of his early career. He crossed the floor to join the Liberal Party. The move shocked both his supporters and his critics. For Churchill, it was a natural progression, a statement that his commitment to progressive ideals was more important than party loyalty. His defection sent ripples through British politics and signaled that Churchill was not a man to be boxed in by political orthodoxy. Churchill's entry into the Liberal Party marked a turning point in his political philosophy. He began to see himself not just as a reformer, but as someone who could shape the future of Britain on the world stage. His rhetoric shifted. He spoke less of conservative values and more of creating a new Britain, one that would modernize and keep pace with the evolving global landscape. Despite his political transformation, Churchill was never comfortable with the concept of compromise. He believed in action, decisive action. He didn't just want to influence the world through words, he wanted to change it. And so, as a member of the Liberal Party, Churchill set to work crafting policies that would reflect his broader, ambitious vision of government. A government that would uplift, modernize, and above all, protect British interests in an ever-changing world. His path was one of ceaseless movement, always in search of ways to bridge the gaps between Britain's imperial past and the demands of the modern world. He argued fervently for social reforms, including the introduction of old-age pensions, and supported measures to increase the minimum wage and improve working conditions for factory workers. These were bold ideas at the time, but they reflected the inner dynamism of a man who, despite his aristocratic background, identified with the struggles of the common people. But Churchill's relationship with the Liberal Party was never a smooth one. His relationship with some of its leaders, especially the more ideologically rigid members, became strained. Churchill was never content to simply toe the party line. He believed in the importance of innovation in leadership and the bold pursuit of policies that could define a new era for Britain. And so, when his efforts to push through reforms encountered resistance, Churchill found himself at odds with many of his colleagues, an experience that would mark much of his political career. By 1908, Churchill had made his mark in the House of Commons, not just as a young idealist, but as a man capable of securing some significant victories. His most important appointment came in the form of the Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies, where he helped implement policies aimed at improving British governance in the colonies. He also began to speak more directly to issues that would define his legacy: imperial defense and the future of Britain's place in the world. Yet, the path to success was never easy for Churchill. He was often accused of being too brash, too willing to break ranks with established leaders. His fiery speeches in the Commons were both admired and reviled. He was a man whose emotions, passions, and intellect were all on display for public consumption. But this very outspokenness would come to be seen as one of his greatest political tools. It allowed him to speak directly to the masses, making him an electrifying presence in British politics. In the years that followed, Churchill continued to fight for his vision of a reformed Britain. He would move between political parties, face crushing setbacks, and emerge each time more determined. His political career was one marked by sharp turns and deep struggles, but it was also one marked by extraordinary moments of triumph. Each political failure only seemed to push him further, deepening his resolve to bring about the changes he thought were so necessary for Britain's future. Churchill's most significant political conflict during this time was his stance on the First World War. As a member of the Liberal cabinet, he played a crucial role in the strategy and planning for Britain's involvement in the conflict. However, the disastrous Gallipoli campaign, which he championed as First Lord of the Admiralty, led to his temporary political ruin. Churchill's leadership was blamed for the heavy losses incurred during the campaign, and he was forced to resign from his post. The Gallipoli failure marked a low point in Churchill's career, but it also revealed his capacity for resilience. Despite the public humiliation, Churchill did not retreat into obscurity. He instead embraced the opportunity to redefine himself, seeking new paths and new allies. The British public may have temporarily turned their back on him, but Churchill's inner fire never dimmed. He would return to politics stronger than ever, learning from his mistakes and determined to avoid repeating them. Churchill's return to the political arena was marked by a reinvigorated sense of purpose. The war years were formative, teaching him hard lessons in leadership and survival. Though his legacy was built on the triumphs of World War II, it was during these early years of political struggle and self-discovery that Churchill's character was truly forged. The horrors of the First World War not only scarred the world but also profoundly shaped Winston Churchill's understanding of military strategy and the nature of leadership. As a young officer during the conflict, Churchill had been an enthusiastic advocate for aggressive tactics, believing in the need for bold decisions on the battlefield. His tenure as First Lord of the Admiralty had seen him spearhead ambitious plans to strengthen Britain's naval power, but it was the failure of the Gallipoli campaign in 1915 that would mark him with the stain of political failure. Gallipoli was a catastrophe. The campaign, designed to break the deadlock on the Western Front by attacking the Ottoman Empire, ended in the death of thousands of soldiers and the retreat of Allied forces. Churchill, who had been one of the primary architects of the operation, faced public and political scorn. The setback was devastating, not just for the war effort but for Churchill's own political career. For a time, he was relegated to the political wilderness, forced to resign from his post as First Lord of the Admiralty. The defeat was not only a military embarrassment but a personal one, forcing Churchill to confront the vulnerability of his once unshakable self-confidence. Yet, Churchill's resilience, his unyielding determination to rise above setbacks, was what ultimately set him apart. Rather than retreat into bitterness or abandon the world of politics, Churchill took his defeat with remarkable grace and emerged from it wiser and more determined. During the years following Gallipoli, Churchill would re-enter the political fray, though he would always carry the scars of that failure with him. His return to political life marked a shift. He was no longer the brash, young man who believed that forceful rhetoric and bold ideas could overcome any obstacle. Now he was tempered by experience, more patient, more calculated, but still just as fiercely committed to his ideals. The war had also deepened Churchill's understanding of the global stage. As Britain struggled to recover from the immense losses of the war, Churchill grew increasingly concerned with the future of the British Empire. He saw the world order shifting and recognized that Britain's imperial dominance was no longer assured. The power of the United States and the rise of the Soviet Union as global powers presented challenges that Churchill could neither ignore nor accept with complacency. His vision was that Britain, in order to maintain its greatness, would need to adapt to these changing circumstances, while still holding on to the values of imperial leadership that had made it a global power in the first place. In the years following the war, Churchill's opposition to the growing influence of socialism and his disillusionment with the Labour government further deepened. His fears about the erosion of Britain's status in the world were matched by his growing belief that the Labour Party's vision of nationalisation and state control was dangerous. While many of his colleagues embraced the more progressive policies of the post-war years, Churchill remained steadfast in his convictions about the dangers of collectivism. He saw the welfare state as a step toward totalitarianism and continued to warn against the unchecked power of the state. He knew that Britain's future would depend on finding a balance between progress and maintaining the principles of individual liberty and private enterprise. As the 1920s unfolded, Churchill's political philosophy began to crystallize. He saw the emerging power of fascism in Italy under Mussolini and the rise of radical ideologies in Europe as threats that had to be confronted head-on. Yet, as much as Churchill was deeply concerned about the rise of totalitarian regimes, his vision for the future was always underpinned by his belief in democracy, personal freedom, and the necessity of a strong, independent Britain in a world increasingly dominated by radical movements and ideologies. Despite the difficulties and the political setbacks of the early post-war years, Churchill's political career was far from over. He had been cast into the political wilderness, but he never lost sight of the prize. The lessons he had learned on the battlefield, in the halls of Parliament, and through personal hardship would soon form the foundation for his future successes. It was during this period of his life that Churchill truly began to understand the complexities of leadership, how to balance ideals with practicality, how to fight for what one believes in without alienating those around you, and how to survive the inevitable betrayals and disappointments that politics brings. The 1920s and early 1930s saw Churchill struggling to find a place within British politics. After the failure of the Gallipoli campaign, and a series of political defeats, he found himself alienated from both the Conservative and Liberal parties. His disillusionment with the Labour Party and his inability to fully reconcile with the Conservative Party's leadership left him isolated. But Churchill, ever the tenacious figure, was not one to remain in the shadows for long. He began to rebuild his reputation, but his approach was unconventional. He advocated for policies that some considered radical, while others saw him as a visionary. One of the most significant chapters of this time was his opposition to the policy of appeasement, which was championed by Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister. As Hitler rose to power in Germany, Churchill saw the dangerous potential of Nazi expansionism. He was vocal in his warnings, repeatedly asserting that appeasing Hitler would not lead to peace, but would only embolden the dictator. Churchill's speeches against appeasement were impassioned, driven by a fierce belief in the necessity of standing up to totalitarian regimes. But in the early 1930s, his warnings were largely ignored by both the British government and the public. Despite his warnings, Churchill was often relegated to the political fringes. The rise of fascism in Europe was alarming, but many in Britain were still hesitant to confront the issue head-on. The scars of the Great War, the economic troubles of the interwar years, and a deeply ingrained desire to avoid another conflict made it difficult for the British political elite to see the danger posed by Nazi Germany. Churchill's constant battle against the policy of appeasement put him at odds with many in his own party, particularly those who hoped to avoid war at all costs. However, Churchill's belief that Britain could not afford to remain passive in the face of fascist aggression slowly began to gain traction. Throughout this period of isolation, Churchill continued to speak out. His speeches were often filled with foreboding and urgency, but they also showed his unshakable confidence in Britain's potential to withstand the storms brewing in Europe. In the face of increasing opposition and the rise of isolationism, Churchill's resolve only grew stronger. He refused to back down in the face of popular opinion. This unflinching determination to be a voice of reason amidst the chaos of political expediency defined much of his career in the 1930s. He was, in essence, a prophet without a nation, a man alone in his beliefs, but never uncertain of the cause for which he fought. Churchill's warnings on appeasement eventually became reality. The Munich Agreement of 1938, in which Chamberlain conceded parts of Czechoslovakia to Hitler, marked the height of the policy Churchill had opposed. For Churchill, the agreement was a bitter confirmation of his fears. Appeasement had failed. As Britain hurtled toward war, Churchill's voice gained in prominence. It was clear that the man who had been sidelined for years now seemed to be the one who had seen the storm coming. During this time, Churchill also began to rethink his views on the British Empire and its place in the modern world. He saw the empire as both a force for good and a symbol of Britain's enduring greatness, but he also recognized that in a rapidly changing world, the empire could not remain the same. As the rise of nationalism in the colonies and the forces of decolonization began to make their presence felt, Churchill's views on empire began to evolve. Though he remained a strong defender of imperialism, he also understood the need for reform within the system. In many ways, this period of reflection on imperialism foreshadowed the larger global shifts that would occur in the decades to come. It was this mix of idealism, pragmatism, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths that would eventually define Churchill's career. The 1930s were a time of intense political isolation for him, but they were also a time of ideological growth. His speeches were filled with sharp critiques of the status quo and impassioned calls to action, and his belief that Britain must be prepared to defend freedom in the face of rising tyranny only intensified as the decade wore on. The man who had been so easily cast aside was now becoming the man the nation needed, a leader who would guide Britain through the darkness of the coming war. By the late 1930s, Winston Churchill's political voice was impossible to ignore any longer. As the threat of war loomed larger over Europe, his warnings about the dangers of appeasing Hitler began to resonate more strongly with the public. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, and Churchill's moment had arrived. The man who had spent years on the fringes of British politics was now poised to become one of the most crucial figures of the Second World War. But as Churchill assumed the mantle of leadership, the shadow of the war, of the sacrifices to come, of the immense challenges ahead, began to grow ever larger. He was faced with the near-impossible task of uniting a nation that had been divided over the issue of war. His speeches would galvanize the British people, urging them to stand firm against the tide of fascism. In these early months, Churchill began to demonstrate not only his political acumen but also his remarkable ability to inspire hope and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. The legacy of Winston Churchill's early political career was now firmly in the making. The same man who had been mocked and marginalized in the 1930s was now the leader the world would come to look to for guidance. His rise to power was not smooth, nor was it inevitable. It was the result of a complex, often painful journey filled with mistakes, failures, and missteps. But it was also the story of a man who refused to give up, who kept fighting even when the odds seemed insurmountable. His early years in politics were the crucible in which his leadership was forged. He had learned the hard lessons of politics, that progress is never easy, that victory often comes only after defeat, and that the road to greatness is paved with struggle. But it was through this struggle that Winston Churchill became the man he would need to be, someone who could carry Britain through the darkest days of the Second World War and help lead the world into a new age of peace and reconstruction. The man who had once been a political outcast was now the embodiment of hope and resolve for a nation on the brink of annihilation. The moment came quickly. On May 10, 1940, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, resigned, unable to rally the nation in its time of greatest peril. His government, weakened by the failures of appeasement, was no longer capable of standing up to the Nazi threat. Winston Churchill, with his long-standing warnings about the dangers of Hitler, was summoned to take his place as the new Prime Minister. It was a moment both exhilarating and harrowing for Churchill, for the weight of the world's fate rested on his shoulders. Upon assuming the office, Churchill knew he would face monumental challenges. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, with France soon to be engulfed by the German war machine. The British Expeditionary Force had been driven back to Dunkirk, and the threat of invasion hung over the nation. The rest of Europe seemed to have fallen under Hitler's sway. But in this time of unprecedented crisis, Churchill's leadership was galvanizing. His voice, commanding and resolute, became the anchor for a nation adrift in fear and uncertainty. Churchill's first days in office were marked by immediate action. He quickly addressed Parliament, delivering a speech that would resonate through history. He famously declared, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat." The speech was not just a call to arms, it was a declaration of resolve. Churchill knew that the fight would be long, grueling and painful, but it was a fight that had to be fought. There was no room for retreat, no time for hesitation. Britain, he declared, would never surrender. Under Churchill's leadership, Britain would dig in its heels. His capacity for galvanizing the British spirit was unmatched. He not only inspired a government that had been teetering on the brink of collapse, but he also gave a battered and frightened public the courage to stand firm. He promised them victory, though he never sugar-coated the difficulties ahead. The path would be fraught with peril, and it would require every ounce of sacrifice, but it was the only path that led to freedom. As the Battle of Britain raged overhead, Churchill became the embodiment of the nation's fight. While the Luftwaffe bombed London and other cities relentlessly, Churchill stood firm. He made it clear that Britain would not be intimidated by the bombing, that London's resilience was a symbol of the nation's unbreakable will. His defiance in the face of such overwhelming force was symbolic. He refused to let his people believe that defeat was an option. But Churchill's leadership was not just about speeches and defiance. His meticulous attention to the practicalities of war, his ability to read the strategic situation and plan accordingly, was equally important. Churchill spent hours poring over military reports, meeting with his generals, and overseeing the war effort in a way that few leaders in history ever have. He understood that leadership in wartime required not only moral strength but also practical, grounded decision-making. And in his relentless pursuit of victory, he was tireless. During this period, Churchill also understood the importance of alliances. Britain could not face Nazi Germany alone, and so, in his talks with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Churchill laid the groundwork for what would become the special relationship between the United States and Britain. Churchill's diplomatic acumen was instrumental in securing American support, both in terms of military aid and eventual direct involvement in the war. His ability to persuade Roosevelt, a man whom many had initially doubted would act, was one of his greatest achievements. And yet, Churchill's leadership was also deeply personal. His relationships with his inner circle, his cabinet, his military commanders, and even his family, were complex. His demanding nature, his tendency to micromanage, and his insistence on the highest standards could strain relationships. Yet, those who worked with him were often inspired by his energy and his indomitable will. His capacity to make others believe in his vision was a key element of his success as a wartime leader. And it was a trait that would continue to define his leadership as the war continued. While Churchill focused on rallying Britain's defense against the Nazis, the nation's morale was tested in ways that few could have anticipated. The Battle of Britain was not just a military confrontation in the air, but a struggle for Britain's soul. The relentless bombing raids, the Blitz, sought not only to destroy military targets but to break the spirit of the British people. Yet, Churchill's resolve acted as a counterbalance. He understood the importance of psychological warfare, and he made sure that the British people never forgot what they were fighting for. Every night, as London burned beneath the Nazi bombardment, Churchill visited the shelters and the embattled streets, speaking to the people and showing them that they were not alone. He embodied the nation's defiance, walking amidst the rubble and assuring the people that they would endure, that Britain would stand tall. His presence became a symbol of resistance. He was a leader who faced danger alongside the people he governed. But the war effort was not without its sacrifices. Food rationing, widespread destruction, and the loss of life were daily reminders of the cost of the struggle. Churchill knew that victory would demand everything. In his speeches, he conveyed not just the weight of sacrifice but the glory that awaited in victory. His powerful oratory gave the nation a sense of purpose even as the cost of that purpose seemed to grow steeper with each passing day. As the war stretched on, Churchill's vision of victory began to take shape. He understood that defeating Nazi Germany was not just about the military struggle, but about the ideological battle that accompanied it. His belief in the value of democracy, freedom, and self-determination became the foundation of the Allied cause. The fight was about more than just military superiority, it was about preserving the very ideals that Nazi tyranny sought to destroy. Yet, Churchill's vision was not without its contradictions. He was a man who passionately believed in the superiority of the British Empire, and he often clashed with those who saw the war as an opportunity to decolonize. His views on empire, though shaped by a deep belief in Britain's global role, often put him at odds with the growing independence movements in the colonies. This ideological tension would become more pronounced as the war progressed and as the post-war world began to take shape. But Churchill's commitment to the preservation of the British Empire was matched only by his commitment to defeating fascism. He understood that the survival of one depended on the defeat of the other. The war, in his eyes, was a battle for the survival of civilization itself. Every moment, every decision, every sacrifice was a step closer to ensuring that the ideals of freedom and democracy would outlast the nightmare of totalitarianism. As the Allies closed in on Germany, Churchill's leadership would see him through some of the most critical moments in history. But his legacy was already being written not just in the victories, but in the strength of character he had shown in Britain's darkest hour. The man who had once been considered a political outcast was now, unequivocally, the figurehead of Britain's fight for survival. By 1941, as the war raged on in Europe, Churchill understood that Britain alone could not defeat Nazi Germany. The situation had changed, and the scale of the conflict had grown into something far larger than Britain's ability to handle alone. It was clear that the war was global in scope, and it would require unprecedented coordination between the Allied powers to defeat the Axis forces. This realization led Churchill to seek deeper cooperation with the United States, with whom Britain had already established a crucial, if sometimes uneasy, relationship. Churchill's relationship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt became one of the cornerstones of the Allied war effort. The two men, despite their differences, Churchill with his imperialistic outlook and Roosevelt with his New Deal liberalism, formed an extraordinarily effective partnership. Churchill understood that Roosevelt's entry into the war was essential not just for the defeat of Nazi Germany, but for securing the future of the free world. The meetings between Churchill and Roosevelt, including the famous Casablanca Conference and the more strategic meetings in Tehran and Yalta, were not merely about military strategy, they were about shaping the post-war world. Churchill, with his understanding of the stakes, took on the role of a statesman who was not just planning for victory, but preparing for the peace that would follow. It was in these meetings that the grand design of the post-war order, one that would see the establishment of the United Nations, the division of Germany and the formation of new global alliances, began to take shape. But even as Churchill worked to cement the future of the post-war world, he never lost sight of Britain's role in it. His efforts to secure Britain's position in the world after the war reflected his deep-seated belief in the value of British leadership. Despite the collapse of the British Empire in the years to come, Churchill's vision for a strong and influential Britain remained central to his political agenda. As the war reached its climax, Churchill's role evolved from that of the indomitable wartime leader to the architect of Britain's future role on the global stage. He understood that the balance of power in the world was shifting, and his role in guiding Britain through those changes was crucial. But in the end, the war that he had fought so hard to win would leave a mark on Churchill's leadership that was both a triumph and a challenge. For all the victories won, the cost of the war, both in human lives and in Britain's post-war standing, was a reality that Churchill could not escape. By 1945, the war had ended in victory for the Allies, but Winston Churchill's journey was far from over. His leadership had brought Britain through its darkest hour, but it would also define his relationship with the post-war world. The election of 1945, which saw the Labour Party under Clement Attlee win a landslide victory, marked the end of Churchill's time as Prime Minister. Though he had led Britain to victory, the post-war world was different, more focused on welfare and social reform, ideals that Churchill struggled to fully accept. In his later years, Churchill's legacy continued to evolve. The man who had once been a staunch imperialist found himself advocating for a Europe united against the threat of Soviet expansion. His ideas on the Cold War and the need for Western unity shaped much of the global landscape in the years that followed. But as the world changed, Churchill's place in it became more complex. His imperial vision seemed increasingly out of step with the emerging realities of a post-war world order. Yet, his legacy as the wartime leader who stood tall against fascism, who inspired a nation to fight against impossible odds, was secure. As Churchill left office in 1945, his role as the leader of wartime Britain had come to an end. But his influence would linger long after his time as Prime Minister was over. Winston Churchill had shaped history, not just through the decisions he made, but through the indomitable spirit that he displayed when it mattered most. And it was this spirit that would continue to define his legacy for generations to come. Winston Churchill's return to power in 1951 was not inevitable, nor was it without controversy. After losing the 1945 general election to Clement Attlee's Labour Party, Churchill's political career seemed to be winding down. Yet, his political instincts told him that the world was changing once again and that Britain needed a strong, experienced leader to navigate the complexities of the post-war era. The early 1950s were a time of great uncertainty for the world, marked by the beginning of the Cold War, the rise of the Soviet Union, and the continued struggle over the legacy of World War II. It was against this backdrop that Churchill made his dramatic return to 10 Downing Street in 1951, leading a conservative government in a Britain still grappling with the remnants of the war. Churchill, now in his late 70s, had undergone a physical transformation. The weight of years in war had taken their toll on his body. His health had begun to falter, and his once legendary energy was often a shadow of its former self. Yet, Churchill's mind remained sharp, and his political resolve remained unyielding. The years following his return to power were defined by his determination to secure Britain's place in a rapidly changing world. He may have been aging, but his leadership, while more cautious, still carried the gravitas of a man who had weathered the storm of World War and seen Britain through its darkest days. Churchill's second term as Prime Minister would not see him leading Britain through the kind of existential crisis that defined the early 1940s, but it did present its own challenges. The Cold War was now in full swing, and Churchill, though a man deeply invested in the past, understood that Britain's future depended on navigating this new geopolitical landscape. He was faced with the daunting task of rebuilding Britain's economy, managing the decline of the British Empire, and ensuring Britain's security in an increasingly polarized world. Churchill's post-war diplomacy was shaped by a keen awareness of Britain's diminishing global influence. Despite his imperialist roots, he embraced the reality that the British Empire could no longer sustain the same level of dominance it once had. Yet, he continued to advocate for a strong Britain within the Western Alliance. One of his most significant achievements during this period was his efforts to strengthen Britain's ties with the United States and to manage the country's relationship with the newly formed European Economic Community (EEC). He was a staunch proponent of European unity but resisted Britain's full integration into the EEC, believing that Britain's destiny lay outside of European political entanglements. His vision was one of Europe but not of Europe, as he sought to maintain British sovereignty while ensuring that Britain remained central to European affairs. Churchill's leadership during this period, however, was often defined more by symbolism than by direct action. The weight of age, health problems, and the ongoing demands of governance made it clear that he was a transitional figure, overseeing the decline of an era rather than ushering in a new one. His health issues became more pronounced during his second term, leading to periods of absence from office. Despite his enduring prestige, his time as Prime Minister in the 1950s was marked by a sense of nostalgia for the wartime heroics that had defined his earlier years. But even as his physical strength waned, Churchill's influence remained enormous. His speeches, though fewer in number, were still powerful, reminding the world of the principles that had guided his leadership through the war. And even as the empire receded and Britain's global stature shifted, Churchill remained a stalwart defender of British values and traditions. His vision for Britain, one that combined the past glory of empire with the modern needs of a rapidly changing world, was one that would resonate for decades to come. As the years passed, Winston Churchill's role as a political leader evolved into that of a statesman, revered for his wartime leadership and increasingly seen as a figure who bridged Britain's imperial past with the changing realities of the post-war world. Though he officially stepped down as Prime Minister in 1955, his influence did not diminish. He remained a central figure in British life, a symbol of resilience, defiance, and the values that had seen Britain through the Second World War. Churchill's legacy, however, was complicated. While he was lauded as the man who had saved Britain in its darkest hour, his legacy also bore the weight of his imperialist beliefs. His views on empire, though rooted in a belief in the superiority of British civilization, were increasingly out of step with the rapidly changing world of the post-war era. The decline of the British Empire, which had been an integral part of his worldview, was inevitable, and Churchill was forced to reconcile his love for the empire with the reality of its dismantling. Yet, his capacity for vision, his ability to see beyond the immediate to the larger questions of history, allowed him to adapt his ideas to the changing world. His speeches and writings in his later years offered profound insights into the nature of leadership and the importance of maintaining moral principles in the face of adversity. He became a figure who was more about legacy than action, offering lessons on governance, diplomacy, and national purpose that transcended the immediate crises of his time. Throughout his final years, Churchill's connection with the British people remained deep. He continued to receive the affection and respect of a nation that saw in him not just the leader who had won the war, but a symbol of the nation's spirit and resolve. Yet, this connection was also marked by a sense of inevitable change. Britain was moving into an era where the old certainties, empire, war, and national dominance, were being replaced by new challenges, new identities, and a new world order. Churchill's legacy, as a man who had lived through and shaped much of the 20th century, was now more of a beacon for future generations than a guide to contemporary challenges. Churchill's final years were spent in the quiet of his home, surrounded by his family and reflecting on his extraordinary life. His health deteriorated, and in 1965 at the age of 90 he passed away. The news of his death was met with an outpouring of grief, and the British nation, along with the world, mourned the passing of a man who had defined an era. Churchill's funeral was a grand affair, a fitting tribute to a man whose life had been marked by such monumental achievements. But even in death, his influence lived on. His vision, his writings, his speeches, especially his immortal, "We shall never surrender" speech, continued to shape the British consciousness. His legacy was enshrined not only in history books but also in the hearts and minds of those who had lived through the war and those who had come after. Churchill's life is a study in the complexities of leadership and the nuances of history. His early career was marked by a series of political shifts, from his initial days as a conservative to his defection to the Liberal Party, and later his return to the Conservatives. His leadership during the war, though indisputable in its effectiveness, was also fraught with moral and political compromises. As the war gave way to a new era, Churchill struggled to adapt to the post-war world, while remaining true to his beliefs, serves as a cautionary tale for future leaders. Churchill's legacy is one of contradictions, but it is also one of timeless lessons. His ability to inspire a nation to stand firm in the face of tyranny, and to lead with unwavering resolve remains an enduring testament to what leadership in times of crisis can be. Yet, his life also serves as a reminder that the path to greatness is not linear. It is paved with struggles, setbacks, and the difficult task of reconciling one's ideals with the changing world around them. For the modern world, Churchill's life offers lessons in resilience, adaptability, and the importance of vision. His story is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is always the potential for redemption and greatness. His leadership, like the history he shaped, will continue to be a source of inspiration and reflection for generations to come. Winston Churchill's legacy is one that transcends the political and historical boundaries of his time. It is a legacy of courage, vision, and leadership that continues to shape the way we understand not only war and politics, but the very nature of human resilience. He was a man who never gave up on his country, his ideals, or his vision for a better world. He is remembered not just as a great wartime leader, but as a man who stood against the tide of history and carved out a path that would lead Britain, and much of the world, into a new era. As time passes, Churchill's name will continue to be synonymous with strength, with moral courage, and with a vision of freedom that continues to resonate today. His legacy is a gift that endures, reminding us all that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit can rise, and that leadership in its truest form is about holding fast to what is right, even when the world around you seems to crumble. His story, and the lessons it carries, will continue to inspire not just politicians, but every individual who faces the trials of life with courage, conviction, and the unshakable belief in a better future.